Hi everybody, welcome to IS 310, Unit 1, Topic 4. Today we're talking about the family of nations, the evolution of the number of independent member states that are recognized by the entirety of the global community from 1945 to the present. So there's 193 member states of the United Nations right now, plus two observers, the observers being the Holy See. The Holy See is the formal diplomatic name of the Vatican and the Catholic Church. And the other is Palestine, which has observer status to the United Nations, but full member status in certain other sub-organizations. We'll look at what I mean by that later, but essentially, any organization that is is a UN organization that's organized at the same time or under the UN Charter, you have to be a member of the full UN and accept the Charter to be in those organizations. But if there was a new organization that came 5, 10, 15, 20, etc. years later, and they have a new set of articles of incorporation or a constitution or a charter, and you can have separate member states, then Palestine had the ability to join there. For example, UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, has a separate constitution. Palestine's a member of that, but they're not a member of the full UN. They're just a member of some UN organizations. A little confusing. Hopefully we clear it out as we go along. So the point of the conversation I want to have today is starts here. So decolonization was always a goal of the United Nations. Certainly you can see from the charter that you've just read that there's a portion of it that's on decolonization, and then the Trusteeship Council to help with that process. The phrase being non-self-governing states. So in 1945, much of the world was in what's considered an NSGT relationship. So they didn't always call them colonies because colonies can be pejorative, especially if an organization or a region hasn't yet had the opportunity for self-determination. That key phrase that Woodrow Wilson came up with in his 14 points, where he wanted the peoples of a region to be able to decide of and for themselves what political affiliation they wanted. He wasn't talking about contiguous geographic portions of the member states of his own or others. He's talking about a territory perhaps further away or ethnically distinct from where they were, and sizable minorities. We'll talk about what that means. So here's the 1945. Everything that's not red, this red color on this map, was a non-self-governing territory. And there's some interesting things there. For example, you'll see way up here, there's Alaska and also Hawaii. In the green color, they were non-self-governing territories in 1945. So as you can see, the commitment isn't necessarily for them to all become independent. It's a commitment for those places to have the right to self-determine. So when finally you had a chance for Hawaii and Alaska in the late 1950s to vote on what sort of affiliation they wanted to have, if any, with the United States, and they chose statehood, then they come off the list of non-self-governing territories because they have self-governed, proclaiming then through an election that they wanted to be part of the larger U.S. whole. So you didn't necessarily have to become independent, you just had to self-determine. But they don't really know how far the process is going to go. So I want to give you this slide next, which is has a graphic representation of the member states of the United Nations in 1945. So first, we want to talk about sovereignty over benefits. Again, keep that in mind, that exchange of sovereignty for some perceived benefit. And I've emphasized that 3 other times now in this unit. We're doing so again here. What I want to emphasize here is that the peers you were trading that sovereignty to in 1945 are different than the peers who have the benefits of that exchange in 2017. So there were 51 original UN member states that participated in the formation of the initial launch of the organization. Here is 6 different regional blocks. Officially, you could put East Asia and Near East, South Asia, and Oceania together in one huge large region that the UN calls, for some purposes, Asia. But they act differently from each other, so I've split them into East Asia, which would be basically east of Bangladesh, the Near East, South Asia, which goes from Bangladesh and India west to the Mediterranean, and then Oceania, which are the island states sort of in the orbit of Australia. So we put those in different spaces to get a sense of where the countries were in the world, because Asia geographically is so immense. And there's some question some people might have as to where Russia is, because it spans multiple continents. For our purposes, and certainly for the purposes of the UN, their most common geographic location is Europe because the seat of power in Moscow is a European seat. So even though they have territory, big territory, lots of territory on the Pacific, they're a European state. Okay, so here's the peers. So primarily you're talking about European and American states. And this is before, for example, Castro's revolution or any significant leftist movement in the Americas. The leftist movements, yes, but nobody's like really taken over a country yet the way Castro will, the way Salvador Allende will go to the left and Nicaragua go to the left. So that, but it's pretty much allies of the United States in 1945. And same with Europe. It's largely Western Europe. You'll have soon some other Eastern states coming onto the fore, and there'll be a Cold War discussion we'll have in this class in a couple of weeks. But this is it. So when you're talking about the United States or United Kingdom trading their sovereignty, you're trading it largely to a group of peers whose politics, whose economy, whose ideology looks a lot like yours. So the risk of them doing something completely averse to your or antithetical to your desires, wants, and needs is relatively small. And if you look back at this list, it's pretty clear that the spot where you're going to get the most addition of countries is in Asia and Africa. But I don't think there's any vision that there's going to become 193 member states. They do, though. And so we want to look at sort of that evolution of the power relationship, at least in some parts of the UN. So let's talk about Africa rising first. So you had a handful of African states in 1945 that were independent. The rest were colonies of various European powers. And so you don't have much expansion of member states from Africa from 1945 through January of 57. I picked January of 57 because in March of 57, Ghana becomes the first sub-Saharan African state to get its independence from one of the existent colonial powers. And that's a big moment because it inaugurates a period where dozens of African states become independent. So Kwame Nkrumah and the Ghanaians sort of are the first out of the gate, but the balance shifts quickly. So by December 1970, you can see that the relationship between the various regions, if they're going to have a vote where regional states get together, or where an ideology of, say, capitalist states or democratic states or whatever they are, maybe they're going to be West European Protestant sort of ideology. If they're going to get together, then in 1945, the way that vote works is different than the way it's going to work in 1970 after the decolonization process is in full swing. You're going to have another process in full swing we'll talk about in a couple of lectures with the Cold War process, and it shifts the balance of power, not quite geographically, but in other ways. But certainly geographically, look at this. So here you have almost 40 states by 1970, and the process is going to continue. So here in 1970, December 1970, there's 127 member states. The newest member state of the United Nations at that time was Fiji in the Oceanic region. And those states in some parts of the UN have equality. So for example, the United States complains that the UN is hostile towards it. The other UN member states are hostile towards it, and that the other UN states have too much power over it. At the same time, a lot of the other member states complain that the United States has too much power and authority and too much influence over them. What they really mean is that in some parts of the UN, the US has more power than they do, and in other parts of the UN, they have more power than the United States. So remember, when we looked at the UN Charter last time, and we mentioned that the General Assembly is a forum where one country, one vote prevails. As the balance of power shifts in the General Assembly, the United States comes to be outnumbered. And it's not just geographic, it's other ideologies and things as they evolve. But the balance shifts. So if the United States expected a particular kind of relationship when it traded its sovereignty in 1945, they're going to inherit a different sort of legacy. That's the point here. There's some additional eras of decolonization. The first when the Caribbean and Pacific states emerge. And so those are the smaller islands that probably weren't really envisioned in 1945 for all becoming separate states. Certainly they were looking at a place like Jamaica, or the Dominican Republic that was already independent, and Haiti was already independent. Those larger islands becoming free and independent, but the smaller states like St. Kitts and Nevis, uh, they weren't really envisioned to become independent. This is a picture here in the top left of the Guianan independence movement. They are physically, along with Suriname, located on the South American continent, but they're treated as Caribbean states because they come of age at the same time as those Caribbean states. Also, what happened is Portugal shifted course in 1974. It had something of a revolution, and they finally agreed to give up their African colonies. So there's a host of other African states that become independent, and the relationship shifts again. The next really big shift, so these are smaller ones. The Caribbean and the Pacific states happened under something called, some people call de-Stalinization. In other words, the bulwark of the Soviet Union and its allied states, its satellite states that weren't in the USSR but were allied with it, they break apart. So in particular, the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia break apart. And as you can see, as the African numbers don't change too much, the European numbers rocket up as the Soviet Union goes from 1 to 14 states and Yugoslavia from 1 to, oh, I should have looked up, 7, I believe, states. Czechoslovakia splits into 2 states. There's a whole lot of activity happening in Europe and more European states. So this is what you end up with in 1990 on the eve of decolonization. So it's shifted from the 1970 we looked at on the last slide through the Caribbean states and Pacific states and the Portuguese former colonies coming independent. And then de-Stalinization changes the way things look. So the regional balance of power looks like this today in terms of the relative number of states in the UN. Now, I'm not going to suggest here that any individual states always has equal power with other states, even in a forum like the General Assembly. Certainly, it's much harder for Tuvalu, a small island state in the Pacific, to do something individually. It's more difficult than it is if you're the individual state of India, which has more than 1 billion people and is one of the top global economies. But if you're going to block up, then there's just ways that you act and interact. We'll look at these regional blocks significantly more, certainly in the third part of the class, but we'll have other things to say about regional representation going forward. There's also a peculiar requirement, requirement at the UN that you're forbidden from having more than 5 representatives in a UN meeting, a General Assembly meeting, and that's to try and protect the small states, but it can still be difficult for them to have 5 qualified and funded individuals to spend time in New York City or in Switzerland or wherever else the headquarters is. They're expensive places to be. So, what does this mean? It means that as the United Nations evolves from the original 51 to the current 193, the group of countries in which a state in the original 51 traded its sovereignty to for the benefits that are going to accrue to it through the UN, it's a different group. And if you had confidence that you were trading it to peers, equal peers, that may not be the reality you have in 2017. So some of the complaints that people in the United States make about surrendering sovereignty are rooted in the shifting nature. So the things that we want to guard and protect would be something like the relationship in the Security Council, where we have a privileged position. Other states, smaller emergent states, maybe not even that much smaller, they're smaller than us, but not significantly smaller, Germany, India, Japan, Indonesia, they would argue that that body, the Security Council, needs to change to accommodate them. We don't want that change. We want to retain it the way it is. Whereas in the General Assembly, where we wish it would sort of go back to a situation where maybe we weren't so isolated in the GA, the point with the UN is it depends. The exchange, though, was permanent. When you make it in 1945, when you agree to a treaty mechanism that's establishing a permanent relationship that your legislative branch binds you to, it's a permanent exchange. It doesn't matter that the relationship between the member states changes. Now, you can get kicked out of the UN, you can withdraw from the UN, but if you're going to be in the organization, you are stuck with whatever the evolving relationship of your individual state to the other states looks like. So keep that in mind. It's a pretty exciting process, decolonization and de-Stalinization. I've got a reading for you about the current 17 non-self-governing territories, some of which you'll have heard of, some of which you will have never heard of, to look through, and a bonus bit about Namibia becoming independent that's pretty interesting. And we'll talk to you next time.